Great to see everyone. This is exciting because it's the first time we are really going to dive deep into the Socratic method as it is fleshed out and practiced in a field location on a theme that is of great importance to us, which is climate citizenship. And so I'm going to start from a Socratic point of view, which is that citizenship is a form of public wisdom, right? Now, what does citizenship mean for you? Now, how have you seen it in action? Things that worked. And we have a cat.
As
Yes.
multi-species as it gets. I can start. I agree with you that the kind of citizenship that we're exploring is different in the sense that we don't want it to be tied to a location, and we want everyone to think in a planetary sense. But that's where we want to get to. I think where we are right now is people just trying to make sense of the place they belong to. And in the Bangalore context, what we've learned is that people can associate themselves to localities in the city, but something like the ward that forms an artificial boundary is not something they immediately connect to. And we are working towards first building that association so that we can start get people to think at the ward level about climate or any other issue. And challenges are as simple as people don't want to move from one area to the other thing. If it's happening close by, we'll come, but if it's in somewhere else in the world, 500, 800 meters, maybe a kilometer, it's too much for them. So how can we make that happen and make it viable and exciting for them to be there and think at the ward level is one. I think in terms of public wisdom, the one thing that has stood out for me is in our discussions with, again, ward members in Bangalore, in one of our convenings where we were discussing health and exploring what are the other aspects of a flourishing life, something that came up was unity, which people say is missing from their everyday conversations now. And what used to feel like a sense of community is not there anymore. People are more like, you mind your own business and I'll mind my own business. And that has really changed how communities function in cities, even though they've been neighbors for years, right? That for me is a differentiating factor in form of public wisdom that otherwise we wouldn't have picked up from unless we had created this space where people were exercising this certain form of
Fantastic.
citizenship.
Like in societal terms, we're in this in between stage where we're transitioning with the economic prosperity. The nature of the society has changed, is changing right now. And in some ways, that reflects what Smithy was talking about, that people don't really engage as much with each other because there is more independence, there is self-reliance, and that's how we also now want to see ourselves as individual units or self-sustained units within a family, which is able to outsource most of its needs to the market. And between the urban and rural experience, I felt that there are still some systems in rural where people still come together to deliberate about things and form pathways. But in urban areas, as an everyday practice, there is no parallel to that. Right? Most of us don't go to our ward meetings. Most of us don't go to any regular engagements where we're actively thinking about the future of the space that we're living in and the institutions that are emerging out of that. So I think those two have been key insights that I feel personally I had in the last few months when we worked on this.
I'm thinking that active citizenship is not just attending ward meetings and then knowing what you can ask for, what you can demand for, but also knowing that when you do these things, you also demand for the rights of people who can't do it for themselves, right? So when you talk about becoming vocal and having an awareness of who stays in the ward, it's also having that empathy about what are the kinds of socio-cultural identities in the ward that you are also speaking for when you speak as a citizen. So especially in the Bangalore context, a lot of the work that we've done is across different kinds of socio-cultural categories, right? We've interacted across the spectrum. And with some of the active citizens, quote unquote, that we've met who are doing amazing work advocating for, say, a zero waste ward or different kinds of things for their neighborhood and locality. When they say active citizenry, are they also keeping in mind the context within which, say, people in the local slums are living in, whether for them something like a zero waste ward is a priority, or whether it's something much more basic like clean water and shelter and food. So yeah, just knowing that active citizenship is also about having that empathy.
Based on my work so far at Socrates, how I've been thinking about citizenship has changed from what I used to think of it as being really attached to the political nation state project to more contextual forms of citizenship. So, for example, in our work with Vaagdhara, what really struck out to me was, although they didn't obviously use the term citizenship or Nagarik or whatever, there was inherently a sense of we are doing this for our community. So I do think there is value in foregrounding these different modes of citizenship.
That we have a lot to learn from that. So this is a good time for us to also switch to the Vaagdhara mode and that experience. Like, what did you see in those communities that expressed what we might see as citizenship traits, right? Solidarity, unity, the things that perhaps are missing in urban settings.
I found that one example comes to mind is that when we were conducting that mock jury in our second trip just before the Samagam, I remember one incident where it was going on for a few hours, and it felt in the middle, in the moment, that we were like strict school teachers, maybe everybody be quiet and listen to us and stuff like that. And then when we got a bathroom break, uh, I was walking around and I was like, other people were also walking, and I noticed that people were actually discussing the issues and they weren't saying, we finally got a chutti or something. So it did show that they were invested in it, which I think may not always be the case in urban things where it's still a little more showy that politics is something distant.
Yeah, if I can just build on that, and I'm drawing from what we saw at Vaagdhara, where definitely what Anshuman is saying, there was a lot of sense of responsibility and commitment to that we need to take action, that we are responsible and we can make this change, right? In fact, for example, during my deliberation in the jury, there was a pledge that was formed by the time I came back that people were taking as a part of the deliberation discussion as a group that we are going to have biogas units and we're going to have solar, and happened organically. Maybe it was I wasn't there how what led to it, but the moderator could have prompted it. It happened right there. That was not part of the deliberation. It was nobody was instructed that there should be a pledge coming out of this. And in other contexts also, when we've done the jury, always with farmers and rural communities, the issues are just too close to their heart for them to be not think about it. But it still feels like in our rooms when we've done something like waste or green entrepreneurship with youth from cities, there's a disconnect. They can switch off their brains when they leave that auditorium or that room. But for them, it's their everyday lived reality. And that is a big difference in how invested they become in the process and how appreciative they are of the platform that we are, for example, or space we are trying to create for them. Yeah. So
was saying, and the political side of it, that there are also political motivations in rural areas. Right? They're not apolitical actors. They also see themselves, while they want to work towards community welfare, they also want to show up at these events where they can build some political clout as well. So in some cases, it's not entirely apolitical, and there are those political actors also who see those sort of benefits. But another thing I see is the very different paces of life. That in urban areas, there is definitely alienation from problems, but it's also, we feel overwhelmed by the system. That where do I even begin to solve the issue of garbage not being picked from the road? Because I could have 10 complaints and then there's no way for me to hold the councillor accountable after that. And how much time people have in urban areas to actually gather for these things. Whereas in rural areas, I felt that with Samagam and even the focus group discussions that we had, people could take out that many hours in their day and they could use their community networks to arrange for childcare, arrange for food when they get home, So those sort of systems allow for very different sort of engagements with the governance and with deliberations. It's hard to emulate that in the city.
I want to.
As a caveat to that, that I wouldn't make that sound like some kind of utopian ideal, right? Where you're in the city, we're alienated from our needs, and in rural areas, you're not. So citizenship is much more visceral and it's much more immediate. I would also say that it's not the ideal, right? Because we know that in rural areas they aspire to move to the city and they aspire for a citizenship that isn't so, visceral and urgent for them.
How did you experience the political agency of the
I
community?
think it's a little hard for us to assess that in this very particular context because we have very limited interactions. But I can speak for a population subset, which is women, who, and for example, for us to get them to interact even in these settings was a challenge. And when we were having the mock jury discussions that Anshuman was mentioning, I tried to bring up why do you attend Gram Panchayat meetings, or it came up in the discussion somehow. And we asked the women in the room, and most of them had not attended those meetings, and they are not taken along with their husbands. And just to get some again engagement from the audience, I asked the question that is that because when you come back home, you want to have food, right? You go to the Gram Panchayat meeting, you come back home and you want to have food, and everybody laughed about it, but they genuinely agree that that's the reason they will not take women along, or the participation of women is limited in these spaces because they have other responsibilities, which could be childcare, food, and it links somewhere to what Alok was saying that it's possible in the rural settings. But that's because Vaagdhara invited them. There is a field officer, so they'll make those arrangements. But on a Gram Panchayat basis, or where you have to be politically active at a regular scale, I feel at least that population subset does not get enough representation because of these other challenges that exist.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah. Another thing, and with obviously this disclaimer that we've had limited engagement with them, so it's hard to assess. But from what we saw, that when a political leader comes and they come with their own agenda, they can make some announcement that such and such scheme we're going to grant to the village, and then everyone must clap to that. And despite the fact that there was a deliberative process and something leading up to this event, it didn't feel like there was an interface between what was being talked about and what was announced. It seemed a little independent, arbitrary, and almost like the political leader already came with a plan that they will announce this, as opposed to it's still actually those decisions being fed through communal deliberative processes.
What I just got reminded of was exactly where I felt this fracture happened, right? When this entire deliberative democracy process leading up to us presenting this charter to the political authority, in my experience, I think that fracture between the people and political authority happened when we drafted the charter itself, because then there was a lot of work that had to go into rewriting the demands of people into language that was sort of something that you can publicly make available, something that you can demand from political authorities. And there was this clear sense that okay, what the people are asking for is, we've noted that, but it's not something that, these aren't really political demands. This is not something that we present to anyone publicly.
After what we've just discussed, one metaphor which the Deepak ji, who is the facilitator in our room, in our jury room, used to describe this thing about basically that in order to give what we're calling a verdict, a jury needs to be politically mature. And he said that you can compare this to when you have a sieve and you like sieve something. We are just at the first step where what we have uncovered and what we've accomplished in this first level is just that first jhatka. It takes much more to get this, what he called maturity. I don't know if that's the best word.
We found ourselves in a place with a very open and welcoming partner, but we also had to put on a show. So what was our show like? Like what worked, what didn't?
Yeah.
What was the gap between what we thought we would do and what actually happened?
What we were definitely were able to achieve is that we were able to organize this massive event where, at least by the optics of it, the voices of these how many ever thousands, hundreds of thousands of people could be channeled in this charter. What the tougher question is what it could bring about. For that, I pass the baton on to the next person.
He ran only 50 meters of the 100-meter part of his relay, and then it's like, I'm passing the baton early on. So for me personally, I feel like it was not just those 3 days, but everything that we built that led to those 3 days was just as important. So whether it was the focus group discussions that we did in a certain way on the first day, keeping in mind what we knew about Vaagdhara and what we thought how we would do it, but we iterated it for the very next day because we learned that some things worked and some things didn't, and keeping the sensitivity of the community in mind, that the field staff, for example, have to go back to these people, and something as small as announcing who would become a jury member and who would be in the
Mm,
audience could create a rift, and stopping ourselves
mm,
from doing that became an important factor for us to consider. Designing those FGDs so that we got people more to participate rather than start focusing on the chart paper and trying to fill in the documents, because our agenda with the FGD was to see who is interacting, who is able to think from the community's lens, and not so much what is coming in the discussion. By the third day, we felt like we had cracked it and we finally knew we were doing the right thing. And because it was the first time we were doing it, there was only so much we could know in advance. But the fact that we iterated each day and were able to crack it by the last day, and it felt like, okay, this is becoming a smooth process that can be carried out with minimum like contrast or negotiations with the people, is what worked for me. And the second, I think, is that, and this is also from different juries that we've been part of, I think we've been able to imbibe in people while we do this process and try to stick to the fact that this is really about the citizens and nobody else. So it's not about the experts, it's not about Vaagdhara. This is their space and their platform. Whether it's in the design of the space, whether in how much time anyone gets to speak, what's going to happen, we really leave that mark on people, that we're able to say that this is designed for them and not by them, but
mhm,
definitely for them. And that really gets across, and in all the bites that
mm,
we hear afterwards as feedback, it worked. For me, what didn't work and we could do better is plan that deliberation process more systematically, because it was quite intense for people when they had just done the discussion, and it just barely started to, all the thoughts had started to sink in, all the discussion started to sink in. We had a gap for lunch, and then they came back and they had to start deliberating. And that is a process. I felt like I was not in control of what was happening and where it was going. So that's a part I would like to work on better.
Puts them behind the curve because then they're solving for the problems that they're experiencing either in the present or have been experiencing for the last few months or years. So rather than actually actively thinking of something and having foresight and solving for and designing for that, we're solving for the problems in the past.
I'll keep it short. I think most points have already been covered. I think in terms of what we could have done better, there's of course many things we can talk about. For example, making sure that the juries were more representative of the people we were talking about. So for example, actually having youth on the youth panel, the panel that spoke about youth, and getting the women participants to be more active. There are a lot of things we could have taken care of, and we will, I'm sure, take care of in the future. But I think what stood out to me as our big success is the process itself, right? So everyone who was involved, helping them understand that this citizenship is not just about the outcomes. It is about the outcomes, but it's also very much about the process. So it's not just the destination that you reach and what you gain through it, but it's also how you get there, right? So this whole process of collaboration, this whole process of speaking for others, speaking for the needs of people who aren't in the room, even the jury selection process, so the caste leaders thinking actively about who can be a good leader of the community. And so I think, just curating that experience of citizenship was something we did really, really well. And the outcomes, of course, some are in our hands, some are not in our hands, but the experience itself was, I think, really well.
which is as good a time as any to come to our last theme, which is what's next, right? Which could be doable. right? It shouldn't be like, अरे हमें इतना काम करवा रहे हो हमारे साथ.
Yeah, they did do it for one of their recent meetings, which I shared, I think, pictures of on our group as well. Where they try to at least make subsets and groups where people are discussing this in a format which looked like a citizens' duty but around a round table. But the specifics of it, I feel like definitely in their caste meetings, there is an opportunity that we inculcate this kind of a process. And it could be that right now it's only the field staff, maybe one implementation member from Vaagdhara who goes there and talks to the caste unit members about what's happening. And so 40 villages still. One caste unit still represents 40 villages. So it could be that can you have a theme for a month and bring in somebody from the outside to speak to them about the issue that they want to discuss for that month, and just bring in this expert kind of knowledge to the community, which maybe is not happening already. Also, we have very limited information on how their monthly meetings happen. One other place that I definitely see format play a role is their sort of BAL committees. So they have for children, they have also communities. And for us, that would be an interesting place to intervene and also see how that changes over the years if we are able to do it multiple. Like, what does it, if we imbibe this thinking of citizenship early on, and they have some very good principles on which these committees are formed, right? It's supposed to be that the older kids form a bridge between the older generation and the younger generation, how kids can find solutions for their problems amongst themselves. Can there be peer-to-peer learning? And putting it there that the Bal Samitis have some kind of a citizens' jury format. This would be for me something interesting. And for what is in the works, definitely we plan to take this Samagam format to different tribal junctions in India, work with different partners and try other forms of the Samagam, which we hope to do over the coming months and have a national sort of convening in August. So through that also, I think Vaagdhara, because it wants to be a critical player, will learn the different forms in which this can be done. So then that could feed back into their process. Those are some ideas I have.
I feel whatever we're doing right now seems very serious. It's all very, driven towards policy solutions. So unless we incorporate some play, fun elements into this and start in different spaces, in that way, I think, so Smriti, Bal Samiti, like if they're organizing some games between different villages, different communities, and then so we can use those spaces for children to think about what they want to play and how they want these to be organized. There could be boat races in the community. There could be other things which are outside of the political realm, but then that's a way for us to embed this way of operating into the culture.
I think we should change something because I think it'll go stale if we go to the same geography and do the same exact process again. Because I think we did our best job in that mode. And as a team and with Vaagdhara's team working in the same mode, I think it would lose that excitement maybe as an organizing team.
Assuming that we are going to be part of their Samagam next year, what should be the framing of that so that it doesn't feel like a repeat?
Yeah.
Amia, you have the final word.
Yeah, no, I think some really good ideas on how we can make sure that this process sustains and how we can insert it into certain committees and events that are already existing. I'm just thinking if we can also maybe adapt this idea of the expert, right? Because having this expert come in from outside and present their solutions, while it works for a large event like the Samagam, just in terms of the logistics and things like that. So I'm just thinking if the expert can also be, say, someone like a local political leader, someone who's hoping to represent the community, run for elections, or maybe even say a local school teacher who wants to secure some funding for the school, or just people who have certain ideas and solutions for the community, if they can come in as the expert in these smaller committees and meetings and present to the jury, and then smaller versions of the citizens jury, if that could be something that we can think about.
Yeah, just somebody who's a representer, doesn't have to be a topic expert.
Yeah. Yeah. Like maybe a farmer who's tried solar pump, for example, tells them about that. If that's the solution that they're thinking.
Great. So, with that thought, thank you everybody for a very pleasant conversation. It's now up to the gods of editing